All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Minnesota Opportunity Collaboratives webinar series. This is our final webinar of 2021. It's really giving a wrap up of this year. I have a couple things on the agenda for today, but first just giving an overview of what Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative is for those of you who may be new to this. Then we'll talk a bit about some of the news around opportunity zones, includes impact to date, some of the federal legislation that's been hovering out there around possible amendments to opportunity zones, and just a little discussion about what the future of the initiative really might be. Then we'll spend a little time on some success stories across the state of Minnesota, some of the things that have been achieved with opportunity zones over the past few years. And we'll talk a little bit about what's next for the Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative as we look ahead to 2022. And that'll include some time for potential discussion here too. So glad to have you with us here today. Just a couple little reminders that we like to put up at the start of all our webinars. I think many people are very familiar with Zoom now, but just a reminder, so no expectation that people are on camera during webinar, but when we do get to a discussion point, feel free to come on camera. You control your own mute here, so happy to field questions as we go along here and have discussions as we go. And we are in Zoom, which means that if you need the chat function, you can usually find that somewhere down at the bottom of your screen. You can also find your mute unmute function here too. So you'll have a variety of tools available just to share your thoughts as we go through this today. So just a little bit about the Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative. It's an initiative that launched in 2018, really right after opportunity zones emerged as a new incentive from the federal government, and they're really trying to bring together developers, investors, businesses, and the whole community development world into one unified effort to really understand opportunity zones, market potential projects across Minnesota, and share best practices around it. And so really with the goal of creating certain social impacts, including things like job creation, attainable housing, revitalizing communities that are in need of that new investment. That's the goal here. We've been staffed by 3 people recently, myself, I'm Carl Shetler, the research director and senior consultant at Northspan. And I've been working alongside my teammates, primarily on this program with Elissa Hansen, our president and CEO, and Ashley Luna, our operations specialist, who is with us on here today too. Also like to take a moment to thank our 2021 funding partners who have made this webinar series possible. These partners include the Minnesota State Department of Employment and Economic Development, Southwest Initiative Foundation, LISC Duluth, and the Minnesota Department of Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation. So thank you to our sponsors. And really there are 3 main goals of MNOppCo. First being that space for statewide collaboration, creating events that can bring people together, just like this webinar, to understand what's going on around the opportunity zones and to learn from each other about it. Second being education events, was especially heavy in the first couple of years of MNOppCo when we're on the road often, getting out into communities, educating people on what this new thing is and how it works. And that's certainly something we remain available to do if there's an interest in a particular place. And finally, maintaining the directory of potential projects in opportunity zones, which we've done since the beginning. We have our listings available on our website, over 60 on there right now of projects that are actively seeking development in their zones. And there are 3 ways to submit new projects to that directory. Include real estate developments, operating businesses that are seeking opportunity zone funding, or just available properties that are in those zones and would be places where development could happen. So a real goal here is to give communities an opportunity to tell their stories, explain why these investments make sense, show the community benefit, and build that case in a way that tells a compelling story. That's something we have tried to do from the start. All right, with that introduction, now shift a little bit into some news around opportunity zones, just to give you a little idea of what's been going on out there recently. I'll just start with the most recent report that we got from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which was released on November 8th, so just 10 days ago. I was looking at the effectiveness of the program, and for the most part, the GAO found that opinion of opportunity zones remains at least neutral to positive across the United States. They're surveying state agencies that are directly or indirectly handling opportunity zones, and 30 of those are saying it had a pretty positive or at least neutral effect, seeing significant investment in their states, feeling pretty good about it. About 20 were unsure, which is not surprising if you followed some of the dialogue around opportunity zones also. Often some of the comments has been, we think it's good, but we're just not really sure where the money is going, given the lack of tracking, so just not quite sure where things are ending up. And then doing the math there were, I think, 56 states and territories surveyed, so there were 6 that apparently thought it was having a negative effect. And there's been a substantial amount of information collected, and in the IRS, is really the only organization that has some ability to track how much investments have been made, and that should say 2019. Through 2019 alone, which was the first really year and a half of operation of the actual investments, seeing 29 billion invested in opportunity zones through 6,000 unique funds. So substantial amounts of money flowing through this program. That's being collected in the tax data kind of after the fact by the IRS, so we don't have a good sense of where those are happening or what's happening, but it's certainly a substantial amount of money. We have some idea of where that's going, just given the parameters of the incentive. And as I shared in a previous webinar, I believe back in the one we did over summer, there have been a lot of attempts over the past 2 years to kind of think about opportunity zones, reimagine them at the congressional level. So there's a fair amount of legislation hovering out there that is could come into being. Variety of proposals to either expand the program, bring in more census tracts, make more eligible, to extend the timeline so that the gains that are being realized for opportunity zones, right now the cutoff for certain of the perks is in 2026. Some of those are trying to extend that to 2029. Most frequent thing we've seen proposed. Also, I've seen a number of proposals around more reporting requirements so that the government and other stakeholders can have a better understanding of where exactly the money is flowing for opportunity zones and where and what the actual impact on communities is from these investments. And so all of that is sort of on the table, but I think we're seeing that it's not really rising to the top of legislative priorities right now. I think, as many of you are probably aware, Congress has been busy with some other stuff, namely infrastructure bill, some of the social spending policy that may or may not yet come through. So because of that, opportunity zones haven't really been rolled in, so they've been, at least for now, put on the back burner, and all of those pieces of legislation that might affect the incentive for now haven't really seen a whole lot moving. And it's been interesting to sort of watch the dialogue around opportunity zones evolve too over time. And here you're seeing that, the first couple of years here, there was a lot of hype around opportunity zones. It seemed like, everyone was putting on a webinar around them. There was all sorts of news around them. Everyone was trying to figure out how they could unlock this. And a lot of that, I think, between the pandemic and simply with time passing, has quieted down. I think the data is showing that there's still a lot of investment happening. So the data from Novogradac, which is a private company that is just trying to collect information on where opportunity zone money is going, shows that there was 17.5 billion raised in the first half of 2021, which, if you look back at those historical numbers I shared a moment ago, was very comparable to the pace initially, maybe even outpacing a little bit. But at the same time, you're just not seeing the same level of hype around it, the same level of discussion, just given everything else that's been going on. It's one other thing that I think is interesting about that 17.5 billion is that it's spread across 1,000 opportunity funds, whereas previous data saw almost 30 million across 6,000. So that suggests that these funds are getting larger. It's actually a smaller number of funds now operating, and which means that I think you're seeing some major institutional players who I think were sort of waiting to figure these things out initially are getting in and sort of throwing their weight around. And it's maybe less of the smaller investors now, and maybe a few more people who have figured out how to use this well, using it repeatedly, using it effectively. And on that note, there was, again, if you go back to the early hype around opportunity zones, there was some talk about how this is this huge solution for many communities. And I think the more sober-minded observers at the time were could tell that this wasn't going to be some sort of silver bullet, but I think that's become more and more apparent over time. It is a successful investment tool. It can help communities. It can be very relevant to building a capital stack to make a project happen, but it's not something that's going to dramatically transform each and every one of those designated census tracts going back to when they were created. And you've also seen that opportunity zones have really evolved in ways that are coming into play in other either state or federal programs also. Anyone who's worked with federal Economic Development Administration, or EDA, has probably seen that. There's things like their funding eligibility criteria will just say all opportunity zones are eligible, whereas in the past there were often far more strict requirements around income levels or poverty levels in certain census tracts or counties or things like that. And lately during the pandemic, often all of that has been thrown out the window and everyone's eligible just because everyone has gone through some sort of crisis in the past 2 years. But as that starts to phase out, I think a lot of these opportunity zone benefits will stay in effect. So you sort of see how they're just sort of becoming part of the lexicon, part of the reality of the economic development landscape, and can continue to be one of the major tools there. And as I mentioned, so far the efforts to change the incentive have not had a lot of momentum. There's a lot of legislation out there, but relatively little of it is moving forward at any real pace. And for that matter, some of the efforts to abolish them, a couple of the opponents of opportunity zones from the beginning, I think, are also kind of realizing that won't happen either. There's some comments recently from the Representative Tlaib out of Michigan, who was one of the early opponents of it, and saying, well, it's sort of accepting that they will continue to exist. So opportunity zones are around, and I think will continue to be around. There are also a couple of possible changes that could indirectly have affected opportunity zones. One is the potential increase in the capital gains tax rate, which has been proposed as a tool to pay for some of the spending bills that are coming out of Congress. And that would have a direct effect on opportunity zones, and that if those tax rates are going up, there's far more incentive than to dump capital gains that people have realized into certain tax shelters, such as opportunity zones. However, at least for now, that has not been enacted yet, and those increases could have been part of the infrastructure bill. They were not. They are still on the table theoretically for the Build Back Better or the social spending bill. We'll see if that goes anywhere. There's some resistance. As with many things involving federal legislation, it sort of depends on what Senator Joe Manchin wants to do. So we will wait and see on that. But I think he has expressed at least some openness to raising the capital gains rate, but probably not at the level that certain other more liberal senators have expressed a desire to do. Another possible change that we talked about at an earlier webinar was the potential for the elimination of 1031 exchanges. Again, this is another tool that a lot of investors will use to shelter their capital gains from taxes. And it was proposed that they could get completely eliminated in some of the legislation flowing through. And for now, that has been put on hold. I'm not sure it was ever a totally serious possibility. It was more of a bargaining chip than anything. But for now, it looks very unlikely that there will be any sort of change to 1031 exchanges. So again, that was another change that could have driven more people to use opportunity zones. So we are not seeing that move forward. So really what you're seeing here is a lot of inertia in Washington, things that could have either made the program more useful or tamped it down or anywhere on a spectrum there just haven't happened. So for now, for the time being, it's just sort of status quo, business as usual. As I mentioned, you're seeing some of these more targeted funds, fewer funds, but still raising large amounts of capital, if not more than before. So you're really seeing more sophisticated investors really seeking out projects that they want. And I'll say that this is something we're sort of seeing on the MNOppCo side too, in that the level of deals may be similar, but we ourselves at this level are hearing less of that. The chatter isn't really coming through of people kind of poking around trying to figure out how this thing works. It's a lot of people who kind of know how it works and are just doing it on their own. I think as we've seen throughout, the most successful developments, or most common developments at least, have been in this mixed use space. So a lot of apartment buildings with commercial on the first floor, a lot of strictly residential projects too. That's really the sweet spot where developers kind of understood this is how we make it work and will continue to make it work. But these aren't the only examples too, and we'll walk through some of those examples in a moment here around the state and see how we are seeing a variety of things. And it looks like really opportunity zones are here to stay. It's an incentive that has proven to be an effective tool to drive investment into certain communities, and as a result, people have gotten used to it, figured out how to make it work, and it's likely to continue at least for the foreseeable future. All right, so now we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about some success stories across Minnesota. So this is hardly an exhaustive list. As people know, it can be hard to track where exactly these investments are happening. And even when we do know, we don't necessarily know all the details, but just walk through some of the ones that we've seen over the state over the past couple of years. So starting with one of the early ones that I know we at MNOppCo used a bit at the beginning was the Board of Trade building in downtown Duluth. This was an old office building that had kind of fallen into disrepair. It was largely vacant, only a few tenants, paying very low rents for very low quality space. We've seen some pretty drastic changes in this building. It was a $75 million project, complete renovations, 84 units of housing put into this former office building, still some commercial space on the lower and upper levels, used historic tax credits. The opportunity to talk to some of the people involved in this project fairly recently, and they were saying that the housing units are completely filled. They've had no trouble filling up all those. Commercial space has been more of a challenge. I think that's the reality of launching your project right before a pandemic, but on the whole, seems like a pretty successful project and certainly doing well on the housing side. And this is also a good project example of one that layered a whole bunch of incentives on top of opportunity zones to make it work. So they had both had some TIF money, there were some historic tax credits used, there was a whole range of different sources that went into this one to make it work, and really shows how you can piece a project together and how opportunity zones can be one piece of that puzzle. The West Side Plats in St. Paul is an example that we have also talked about several times, and over the course of our webinar series, we actually had a full webinar devoted to that one, which is available at the link there. It was our December webinar from last year. This was really a great example of community engagement around a project where the developer had the concept, but the neighborhood, predominantly low income, people of color neighborhood in St. Paul on the west side, which means south of the river in St. Paul. They were not thrilled with some of the concepts that was here, so there was some pretty extended community dialogue around this one. They were able to get some of their concerns incorporated and move forward with a successful project that had support from the community and still met the developers' financial needs too. So, success story we like to tell. Another example that we have featured on MNOppCo, one of our webinars earlier this year, back on July 28th, was the North Shore Adventure Park. So this is a completely different concept up in Silver Bay, where you've got a outdoor recreation focused business that was able to capture some of this funding, building a ropes course, rock climbing wall, and with several plans for phased expansions from there too. And a real great example of revitalization in a community on the North Shore of Lake Superior that historically was a mining town, hadn't seen a whole ton of investment in the tourism economy that really has come to dominate the North Shore, and was kind of this missing link in there. So, and really seen how this particular development has been a catalyst for some other things that have followed there too. So, great example of transformation through that success. Another one that was somewhat unique was the Bessemer at Seward Commons in Minneapolis. It was a 128-unit housing development that really came out of another really strong community-led planning process. There was a local nonprofit kind of specific to the Seward neighborhood in Minneapolis that was driving that. It was a neighborhood that really not seen any substantial major market rate apartment developments in years and years, but through the process of engaging the community, getting people on board with how this was going to work, we're able to move it through. And that development was successful and got off the ground, and was a great story for that neighborhood. Birdtown Flats in Robbinsdale, not a project I know especially well, but another success story, 152 market rate units out in Robbinsdale. successfully developed. The Hyatt House in Rochester is a more recent one, opened in 2021, and this was another example of one that really fit a community need, had providing extended stay accommodations near the Mayo Clinic. Obviously, Rochester gets a lot of traffic for people who either they themselves or their family members are facing medical challenges and might be in for a long stay in Rochester, and making sure that they had affordable and high quality and good options for where they can stay while they wait out maybe an indefinite period. And 172 new units in the Hyatt House that came online earlier this year. And a couple of other examples here of projects that we know have been successful. Can't say for certain that they use opportunity zone funding. They may sort of neither confirm nor deny these things because they just don't want to share this, or it's hard to say. But some of these projects that have been successful that we had listed on our database that have successfully found funding include a senior living facility in Pine City that is getting up off the ground. That's the background picture you see there. Temple Opera building in downtown Duluth, originally part of a entertainment facility, became an office building and really got a gut job renovation redone, and is now home to a bank and several other businesses in downtown Duluth and a historic block there. So that one was successful, and then there are almost too many to count of these housing projects that were sort of at least poking at opportunity zone funding, weren't sure whether they could use it or not, and a lot of those have now been successful. And, it's likely that some of them used opportunity zone funding. We just don't necessarily know unless people are reporting it. Some of the others that are at least getting off the ground as we speak, the Lakeview Tower in Duluth, which some people might remember as an early example we talked about on here and got some early hype, has been hit a series of delays and snags, especially through the pandemic, but there's been a fair amount of site work done already, and I believe the plan is to finally officially start the actual construction process next spring. Housing development in Columbia Heights, so in the north suburbs there. And one of the more unique ones we've heard about is this VA clinic in Albert Lee, which is, may seem like an unusual use in that it's being run by the VA, which is public, but at the same time, this is the investment that goes into it. However, found a way to structure that as an opportunity zone deal and pull it off. So that one is also breaking ground and moving forward. And a number that are still in the pipeline, still seeking funding. Some of these first two there were winners in our opportunity zone summit a couple of years back. Still very good concepts, but hit the brakes because of the pandemic for various reasons. The Brooklands building in Brooklyn Center, which is commercial spaces, understandably had some obstacles there. Housing development in Redwood Falls that we also had. Data center project all the way up in International Falls that has continued to poke around, seek investment. The V3 Center in Minneapolis, it's just sort of an athletic facility targeting youth in North Minneapolis. Continues to raise funds on its own, has been making progress there. Vernon Building is a housing project in Duluth that I think was first proposed probably about a decade ago, went kind of quiet for a long time, but suddenly has new life. Seeing some progress there. And then the Armory renovation in Duluth also is another one that has an active nonprofit trying to make that one happen. So a lot of projects in different stages. Certainly the pandemic did not help, but certainly seeing that these can be successful in communities all over the state of different sizes, and that these projects can and do happen. So with that, we'll transition to last sort of segment of our webinar here, talking about our future with Minnesota Opportunity Collaborative. And so it's really been a great ride these past 3 going on 4 years. And but however, this webinar really is going to be our last formal piece of programming that we have scheduled, at least for the foreseeable future. We found that there is continued interest in keeping the project portal up and running, so we will certainly continue to do that. We're also open to doing one-off events. The community has interest in educating its stakeholders around opportunity zones. We're available for that, so feel free to reach out for me if you're interested. But for the time being, I think that our webinar series, I think we're very pleased with how it's gone, and we've been able to highlight some things, and we're ready to sunset it and move on. So we will certainly continue to monitor other things going on, send some updates if there are any policy changes, major developments with the incentive. If some of that legislation ever moves, obviously that will be cause for discussion. So it may revive and do a one-off or something around one of those. So maybe less programming, but we're still be monitoring this very carefully just to see what's going on and going forward. So look for that as new things develop with opportunity zones. I want to spend a little time saying thank you to the many partners who made this whole series possible. There are really too many to list here, but we'll start out with some of the people who were some of the impetus for Northspan's work in opportunity zones at the beginning. People like Barb Hayden, retired planning director with St. Louis County, Jason Holliday with the Fond du Lac Reservation, as people who came on board and were saying, how do we get these census tracts designated? Figuring this out from the very beginning. Some of the early catalysts for that. I think Pam Kramer and her team with LISC Duluth, who really spearheaded the idea of this creation of a project portal, first for the city of Duluth, that then ended up going statewide. So to Pam and her team for their support every step of the way through this process. They've been excellent to work with. And wish Pam a happy retirement too, as she has that pending in the next couple of months here. Thanks to Lynn Osterman, who many of you probably got to know in the early days of our work. She was our partner in many things, especially in the Twin Cities area and in southern Minnesota, on the road a lot, doing a whole bunch of events, and she was a very valuable partner in building a lot of our connections there. Danielle Lewis, who appeared on many of our webinars and our more regional education events, is an accountant with Whipley who was there from the start, figuring out how this worked and how it could work for her clients. And she continues to be a great resource who will continue to funnel people to if they need help making the accounting work on an opportunity zone. And similarly, Emily Chad from Frederickson and Byron, from a legal perspective, understanding the legal ramifications of opportunity zones. Thanks to Terry Tao of Nexus Community Partners, who was another early leader in figuring out how it works and really driving the community engagement side. And so she was our partner on several panels and talks around opportunity zones. All of our sponsors who have made this financially possible over the years, listed this year at the start, but numerous others over the past couple of years who really showed us the importance of opportunity zones and understanding them to their communities. So we thank them and many, many other people who don't have time to list off, but were really vital in driving this forward. So with that, we have a few people on here today. I certainly want to open it up a little bit here. If there's anyone who wants to talk a little bit about what your experience has been, I'm happy to hear any final thoughts here on how things have gone, what's worked well, significance of opportunity zones to you. I'll just throw it open for a moment if anyone wants to share any thoughts or feedback or experiences over the past few years. Feel free to unmute or come on camera. Anyone with any thoughts? All right, well, hearing none, I don't need to belabor it, but I'll just say thank you for joining us here today. Appreciate it. Somewhat shorter webinar, but if you want to see the recording of this webinar, it will be available on our website at MNOppCo.com/events, always available there. And if you have any questions, any follow-up, always available. My email is here. It'll be available when webinar goes up, and we will follow up with everyone who registered with webinar with the link to the recording. So thank you again for your time, and appreciate your participation.